Sweet.
We're live.
Welcome. We're live. We're back. It's been a while.
It has been a while.
Yeah.
At least for me. Definitely for me.
Definitely for me too.
Yeah.
Haven't sat down for podcasting in a little bit. Whether this is physical education or something else. A little bit of time to talk with one of our coaches here and get into some topics that, I think matter certainly for our members, for the general population at large, and something that, you've identified as like a question a lot of people have, or something that often is the reason that people start seeking out, working with you, working in the hybrid program. So what are we talking about today?
We are talking about strength for runners and why it matters, why it's important.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. It's been one that's been on my mind for a while. If you've been following along with like the Lumos side of things and like our hybrid program, this is something that was a hole in the program for, the first year, and part of me or part of us wanting to build it into like a full 5-day-a-week program was so that we could offer this strength training, because I believe so deeply in its complementariness. It's a natural complement for running, and like important to your improvement of running.
And I think it's funny that you call it a hole.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people would have looked at it and thought, or certainly people outside of this gym, and go like, oh no, they're doing plenty of strength training.
Yeah.
They're doing lunges in a long conditioning workout. They're doing things that require your muscles, so that is strength training.
Yeah.
And I think like one of the big points that you were trying to drive home was like, this is not discrete enough. This
Correct.
is not the way that, the rest of the world strength trains.
And it's not getting you the stimulus that is important from strength training.
Right.
You
To
know what I
build
mean?
like strength capacity.
To build the things that you need for running, right? And like, we'll talk about all that stuff, but the tissue tolerance, right? Tendon strength, all those sorts of things. Doing, 100 lunges in a conditioning at like super low maximal or, super low percentages efforts, right? It's just not going to create the same result that you're looking for.
But even though that is often what people training for a HYROX,
Yep.
people running and training to like supplement that might be the kind of way that they strength train. But
Right.
like for, I think it is a good segue, like, speaking globally, like what are the benefits of strength training? And I think,
Yeah.
in the sense that this applies to if I am a runner, but also if I'm not a runner.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like one of the big things. Like a lot of these benefits like are overlapping, and so kind of regardless of whether you're
Agnostic.
a runner, yeah, it's like how much specificity do you need versus like how much health do you need to be able to continue to do whatever it is that you want to do, right? So whether you're a runner specifically, right, you need strength training to create some adaptation so that you can run better and more injury free. If you're just general public and you like running, right, you probably also want the benefits of strength training, right? And so, yeah, what are some of those things? Well, it's like, increased muscle mass, right, is like just great in general. It's like one of the biggest longevity indicators, and, really important for metabolic function. Bone density, right? Increases in bone density is like super linked to strength training and resistance training in general, and like doing it at reasonably high loads, right? So it's like not like in the conditioning version that you were just talking about. So being able to increase bone density and just your overall resilience as we age, tendon health, right? And tissue tolerance. And that's going to be one of the things we'll talk about more specifically as it relates to, why this is so helpful for runners, right? But being able to create the joint integrity and joint stability, across, a large range of motion is really important. So, whether you're a runner or not, I think all of those things matter a lot. Right. And just like, being able to function in the real world, right. Being able to apply force to objects around your house, getting things in and out of your car, right. Being able to lift and move things are just going to help you function better in the world. So regardless of kind of what your point or what your specific end is, right. Like strength training is helpful for almost everybody, right? Almost everybody, different flavors for different purposes, but right, like at the core, everybody's going to get a little bit of those things. And like, that's really important for almost every human on the planet.
Yeah. Most of the time, the benefits that you're getting from strength training, like are they are agnostic in the sense of like they don't care how they are applied,
Right.
but they will be universally
Correct.
applied. Like
Yeah, they will- right.
there is no way you can't kind of do it wrong in the sense of like, oh, you got really strong, but it doesn't show up doing X. Like,
Correct.
That's not
It's
really
pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a, it's certainly a surplus of strength, like it is going to apply to whatever task you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways certainly to make it more or less specific, but I would say like most strength adaptation is pretty broad in general,
Yeah.
which is good.
For sure.
Getting into like, we kind of teased like we should be back here and good. Yep.
Am I back here? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff. All right.
All right. So before we were so rudely interrupted, we were talking about age, right? So like we teased this before. We talked a little bit about like running is important for everybody, especially as we age.
Yeah.
And I think a point that you make often is like sort of thinking about age in a couple of different ways, right? It's not just purely a like, are you 20 or are you 30 or are
Yeah.
you 40? So tell me what you mean about that. Tell me what you mean about like biological age. And then we're not going to talk about what's that weird thing that the app does sometimes. Like what's your,
Fitness age?
your fitness age
And
or your
I'm 12
actual
and a
age.
half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so fit. I'm 5.
I'm an adolescent.
Yeah. No, your training age.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
what's the difference there?
Yeah. So, a couple things right? Like if we think about these as two totally separate concepts of age, right? You have your biological age. And as most of us get past like the early to mid 30s mark, we're going to like experience natural declines in bone density, muscle mass, power expression, right? And not like to huge chunks
I'm
year on
shocked.
year. Right. VO2 max, right? We could have a whole other podcast on VO2 max.
I call it VO2 min now.
VO2 moderate.
Yeah.
Right. And all of those things you're going to see, like, for the most part, without intervention, natural decline kind of once you hit a certain age, usually like mid 30s, late 30s, it just kind of depends on the person. And so, we want to resist that natural entropy of those, of those qualities, you know what I mean? And so strength training is a great way to not only minimize, but in a lot of cases, depending on where your experience level is, and we'll talk about that in training age in a second, but you might reverse some of those things, right? It is totally common for someone at 50 years old to begin strength training and they're stronger, more powerful, whatever at 53 than they were at 50. That's totally normal, right? Because those gains offset the kind of natural entropy, right? So that's kind of one side of it, but just understanding that you're going to have all those qualities that we talked about at the beginning of strength, you're going to have a natural decline in those as we get older, right? So being able to reverse some of those, or at least minimize the decline, is really important, especially, right, because all of those things are important for runners, right? Tissue health, tendon health, right, your ability to, your cardiorespiratory ability, all that's important. So it's important from a biological age perspective. The other component would be, your training age, right, which is, how long have you been doing this? How much, and it's not necessarily how long you've been doing this, but how much of the kind of easy gains have you captured? If you've never run at all and you go run an easy 5K every day, you're going to experience a lot of improvement in a very short period of time, right? But that's because your training age is really low, and you're just gaining a lot of these kind of, beginner, newbie gains, right? And that's great. Like, knock them out, get them all, right? But once we've kind of cleared that first kind of hurdle, that inflection point of like, yeah, these gains aren't coming so easy anymore, most runners, right, are going to experience their limiting factor, like once they hit a certain training age, probably 2-3 years of consistent running, where your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, a lot of these like physiological things aren't going to improve that much more, right? But what can improve almost infinitely is how efficient you are in your running, right? And your, what we would call like your run economy or your run efficiency, right? I like to think of it as like miles per gallon in a car. You're not going to change the car's engine a ton, right? But if you can make it more efficient, it can go faster and further at the same level of output, or at the same level of cost.
Yeah, I know we're going to talk more about the economy and sort of like that is one of the big pillars of like why we should be doing this.
Yeah.
I do think you bring up an interesting point is that like that sort of like gains plateau that I think that also is sort of universal.
Yeah,
right. Again,
sure.
if we're talking about strength training as like, listen, there are basic kind of like biological realities that if you do X, you're going to get better at Y.
Yeah.
Broadly, right? I think also that tends to across things, whether I'm powerlifting, whether I'm running, whether I'm doing CrossFit, whether I'm whatever,
Yeah.
that 2 to 3 year mark is often for a lot of people where, you know, they start kind of running into those first like truly challenging plateaus. And it does seem like a lot of programs don't have an answer for it, right?
Yeah.
There are a lot of programs out there that after you get to that point, and that can be sometimes, you know, there can be different reasons for that, why that, what the limit is, right? Whether
What's
it's
the
like,
limiting factor? Yeah, exactly.
it can be, you know, listen, this is a purely online program. It's generalized to a broad public. It doesn't know when you are going to hit your training age plateau.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a point where you're like, oh, this feels like I'm not getting any better.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, because this program probably assumes that people are starting from wherever.
Yeah. What you need when you're on the kind of upswing of that training age curve is different than what you need once you're in like the middle inflection point, and certainly different from what you need when you're in the deep end of that inflection point.
Yeah, the discretion, right?
Yeah.
The ability to be discreet and the ability to, you know, in the powerlifting world, what we always talk about is like, you want to run the most basic linear progressions you can as long as you can.
Yeah.
It's the easiest and fastest way to gain strength. And after you've done that, usually the next thing you start doing is playing around with sort of intensity and rest, because that becomes the thing. And it seems like, again, broadly, comparatively, common in running. It's like you have to be...
Yeah, it's common in everything.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you have to identify what the limiting factor is. And when we look at running, right, it's like, okay, I'm not going to, you know, my VO2 max will continue to improve, or, you know, if you're not familiar with VO2 max, right, like the engine, right? The physiological engine is going to continue to get better, but not by 10% a year, you know what I mean, right, in perpetuity, right? It's going to tailor off a little bit. And so where can we continue to make the gains? And in the running world, you can continue to make the gains by improving your running economy, which is just how effectively and efficiently you absorb force from the ground with each step, and how effectively and efficiently you input force into the ground with each stride, right? And strength training can be a great way to help improve that.
As I say, that's a good segue into, you know, we mentioned running economy twice now as one of these like two kind of big pillars of like, strength training is going to help me with this. If I get help with this, I will be a better runner.
Yeah.
One of them is running economy, so let's talk about that a little more.
Yeah.
And then the other is just injury prevention, right? It's just about staying in the game.
Yeah, I mean, those are really the two things of like, why should a runner, you know, maybe we should have led with this, right? But like, if I'm a runner, why should I strength train? Like, those are the two reasons, right? Mm-hmm. Injury prevention and help improve your running economy. So yeah, we can start wherever you want. But.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk. Well, we talked a little bit about running economy.
Yeah.
Let's dive deeper. I mean, you said before, like you equated to how is your engine, you know, an old V8 like
that's just leaking
loud
power
and whatever,
everywhere.
leaking power or whatever, or is it a kind of like modern?
How tight, efficient, you know, that all of the force that you produce, all of the effort that goes into each stride actually goes into moving you forward, not up and down, not like loose in your core, in your midline, and you know you're running like one of those like balloon guys from a car dealership. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Everywhere, or Phoebe from Friends.
Right.
Yeah.
Either way, you know, pick whichever analogy you like. Right. But if we're not able to, you know, kind of bookend the force that you're putting into the ground so that as much of it as possible goes towards you moving forward, that is not economical, right? And so when we talk about improving running economy, we're talking about improving the way that you disperse force and create force. And strength training is a great way to do that. If you can improve your overall force production, the odds that you're going to improve the, you know, what we would call rate of force development, or the speed at which you can create that force, that's what's really important for running, right? It doesn't matter that you have 1,000-pound deadlift, right? That's not going to make you a better distance runner. But being able to apply the right amount of force quickly, that will improve your running economy, right? And
a deadlift in and of itself.
A deadlift in and of itself,
right.
But being able to having more force to give generally helps people improve the speed at which they apply that force, and that's going to mean that you're going to be able to turn over faster, you're going to spend less time on the ground, and you're going to propel yourself forward a little bit more efficiently, right? So that's kind of where that strength training tends to help out from that running economy standpoint.
And here's something inside of that I think we should point out. Like, I think a lot of times people think about, you mentioned it before, tendon stiffness.
Yeah.
Right? And they go, I don't want my tendons to be stiff. They think of that as like, oh, I'm not going to be able to move.
Yeah.
I'm going to be stuck in positions. Can you explain like elasticity and stiffness?
That's a really good point. So tendon stiffness happen, first to like debunk the myth, or not even the myth, but just that that doesn't sound good. It sounds like a bad thing. It's like tendon stiffness happens in the direction that you train it to happen in, right? And so it's like, do you want all of your tendons to be stiff in all directions? No, definitely not, right? That's not a good thing. But, if you think about what happens when you run, and specifically with the Achilles, a little bit like in our hips and our hip flexors and stuff like that, and then we're getting into the difference between tendon and muscle stiffness. But, in general, you want your tendons to be stronger and have a little bit more recoil aspect, right? And we call that tendon stiffness, right? And so if you think that every time you plant in the ground, right, and your foot is going to move like this, right, your Achilles is stretching and then shortening, stretching and then shortening. Your calf is doing the same thing. And when we call that whole system, we have names and stuff for it, the stretch shortening cycle and all that, right? But in general, the stiffer that our tendons are in the direction that we want them to be stiff, the more that they're going to do work for us, and our muscles don't have to do work. And the cool part about that is tendons don't have a metabolic cost, right? I don't need to breathe in more oxygen for my tendon to stretch more efficiently. But for my muscle to stretch and work, I need fuel.
Blood flow.
Yeah, I need fuel. So that's why tendon stiffness in the right direction really helps, because it doesn't cost anything while you're running. And when I say it doesn't cost anything, I don't need more oxygen, I don't need more carbohydrates, I don't all the things that are there to produce energy. I don't need more of that to get recoil from, the bounce that happens.
And then, I think this segues well also into the second kind of pillar of this injury prevention.
Yeah.
What happens if my tendons aren't stiff? What happens if my tendons are not up to the task of the, I'm going to go out and run a half marathon or
100%.
Like that.
Yeah, 100%. I think, though they're not the same, tendon health and tendon stiffness aren't necessarily the same thing. But what I would say is that helping either helps both. You know what I mean? So not confusing the two, but the same stimulus of strength training for the most part, and plyometrics, and just a well-rounded program that's not only, running, is going to help both of those things. So, in injury prevention, obviously the most common thing with runners is overuse injuries, right? And so you're doing the same repetitive task over and over again every time you land on the ground. So if you run 5 miles, you're taking 8,000 steps, 10,000 steps, right? And each step, you're putting significantly more than your body weight force into the ground, right? So it's that's a lot of cumulative load on your bones, on your joints, on your tendons. And so if they're not prepared for that, right? Part of that is also volume progression, right? Getting them prepared by not going from 0 miles to 20 miles a week or 40 miles a week. Of course, you're going to get injured doing that. But one of the dials that we can twist a little bit is, strength training and creating some more joint integrity, so that, once you kind of hit some of those training plateaus, right? And maybe the answer for you is you just need to run more volume. If you want to continue to get faster, you need to run more volume. Well, every time I try to run more volume, I get injured, right? And that's the cycle that I know a lot of runners feel themselves in. It's I get that kind of 18 to 20 miles per week mark, and every time I try to push above that, I get an overuse injury in my knee, I get an overuse injury in my Achilles, I get plantar fasciitis, right? All of these things. And if we can make the system overall a little bit more resilient, a little bit more structurally, have a little bit more structural integrity, which strength training does, we can stave off those injuries and give you an opportunity to acclimate to some of that higher volume. You know what I mean? So yeah, from an injury prevention standpoint, placing the right amount of stress on the right tendons in the right directions is going to help them not experience some of the overuse injuries in the margins that a lot of runners experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it often as like, if the only way that we're building tendon stiffness, muscle, muscle ability, force production, things like that, is through running. Mm-hmm. And say I start at 0 and it's like, okay, now I'm running 3 miles a week, 5 miles a week, 10 miles a week, whatever. Your capacity is basically exactly what you've done and nothing more. Yeah. Right? So if I've gotten up to 10 miles a week, my like tendon capacity, muscle capacity is 10 miles a week.
Correct.
And so you're like skating on this very fine line. And if for some reason you get some bad sleep or you have something that like makes you work a little harder than whatever
route than usual.
Yeah, you have no leeway. You have no like surplus. And so I think one of the things in like when you strength train and you're able to basically, what strength training is, progressive overload. Yeah. You're able to overload safely one of these aspects of what you need. And now I've got the tendon capacity, muscle capacity of somebody who's running 20 miles a week, but I'm only running 10 miles a week.
Yeah,
right?
It adds a lever.
Yeah, my ceiling is just so much higher. So that even if I have, it's hot out, it's whatever, any of those things, it's still so well below my capacity that injury problem doesn't like rear its head.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the other thing there is like, in a well-balanced program, right, a lot of injuries happen from overuse, but not from truly too much volume, but from like imbalances, mm-hmm. right? And so, like relative strength imbalances, either like front side, like so your quads versus your hamstrings, or right, like a lot of it happens like in lower extremities, like I'm not able to like produce as much force on the front side, my anterior, like my shin meat, mm-hmm. Anterior tips versus like my calves or vice versa, you know what I mean? And so having some balance in strength among those things, that then, I'm now a more balanced athlete when I put force into the ground and I have more tissue taking the load, that's going to help give me more capacity. So just the balance of it in general, not even like I'm that much stronger, but I'm that much more balanced, is going to give you like more leeway and more margin for error, like you were just talking about.
Cool. All right, let's play a little game to kind of like finish things off.
Yeah.
We're going to take kind of a couple profiles of like different runners, right? They're, all, let's say like early 30s-ish. First, let's just talk about like what would your criteria, like what would your rubric, your sort of thinking be for different people? What do you go through when you're like, okay, I've got a group and they're, person A, person B, person C, they're all a little different. What do you look at for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what their goals are is most important, right? So, I have several clients who are just like general health, right? Like what's the most important thing to you is that I'm healthy. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where you should strength train for all the gains of strength training, separate from what they will do for your running. You know what I mean? But you should, probably also do some sort of cardiovascular exercise. And if running is a domain that you like, very cool, right? So that's like one bucket that I would put people in. And that's going to look a little bit different. The strength training is going to look a little bit different because strength is an end to itself in that person.
You've talked before about like the way that you design things for each person, different people, is starting with their why and using that to kind of like guide from there. Can you tell me about kind of like that rubric?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think a lot of people get like too beat up on like the what's and the how's of their program. And, everyone, we kind of talked earlier about how so many people need strength training, right? But it might look different for different people, right? And so understanding why you want strength training first, or like what your end goal is really going to dictate the kind of what's and how's, more than just like, oh, let me grab this powerlifting, Coach Brett says I need to strength train. Let me grab a powerlifting program and just add it to my half marathon program. It's like, that is a terrible idea. Like, please don't do that. If you're listening, please don't do that, right? You're going to burn the candle at both ends and almost certainly injure yourself. You know what I mean? So you need to like think about what you want out of your program. And so what are the things that I look for? Well, I look for their goals. I look at like what people's kind of current volume and like what their current tolerance is. So it's like what capacity they've built up to this point. And then I look at like their training background, right, and what their capabilities are, and like where their kind of current strength levels are, right? So like once you start to put all of those things together, you can kind of like start to break out like different avatars, if you will, and each of those avatars should probably experience strength, or like they should have a different strength program for each of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So like, thinking about these kind of like sort of avatars, like somebody who's just like, hey, I want to get in better general shape, I want to be healthy, I want, maybe some longevity or something like that. Like, what are they looking for, and how do you approach their programming there? Yeah, so somebody like that is going to use strength like as an end to its own a little bit more than maybe somebody who's just purely running. You know what I mean? So that person's probably going to do a little bit more like kind of pure hypertrophy work, a little bit more kind of like full body or full balance stuff, a little bit less kind of sport specific, right? So they're probably going to do a little bit more two-legged work than like unilateral work, which I like a little bit, to bias a little bit more for runners for stability purposes. So yeah, they're going to want to express strength for the sake of like being strong itself, not just how it translates to running, right? And that's going to look a little bit different in terms of like what their day-to-day looks like. Yeah, what about somebody who comes in as like, I'm a runner, right? Like I race a couple half marathons a year. I race a couple, maybe I do a marathon or two a year. I mean, I know some people do a marathon every month or something. Like, it just depends, and there's all across that spectrum. Yeah, but like they run, they compete, they have time on their mind as far as like, completion time, things like that. Yeah. So they're going to have like a lot more of like a periodized structure, right? And we can do other videos on that. But basically, their strength training is going to phase with their run training. And that's really important, right? To not be doing heavy squats the week that you're going to compete, or the day before that you're doing super hard run sessions, right? So the balance and managing the fatigue is going to look a little bit different. I'm not as worried about those people like getting like the perfect ranges of motion, right? If I need to put them on a box and do box squats instead of like ass to grass squats, like that's totally fine, right? Like the goal is to create strength and power in whatever range of motion that is, so that it can be more applied to that kind of rate of force development, their ability to kind of create and disperse force when they impact the ground. They're going to do a little bit more like unilateral or like one leg at a time work, because I think that's really helpful for stability. Not only one leg at a time, but like they're going to get a little bit more bias towards that, because it's a little bit more specific towards running. So yeah, and they're going to do things that might look very different from somebody who's just training for like hypertrophy and that kind of like general strength and cardiovascular health. Yeah, and they're like their strength is serving a very specific activity. Correct. Yeah, and some of their strength work is going to be not loaded work, right? Some of it's going to be plyometric, right? You know what I mean? And like how quickly they can, but I would consider that resistance training because it's significantly higher resistance than the sport that they're used to, Yeah. Okay, and then the big wild card and the popular one of right now, like a hybrid athlete, somebody who is doing something like a HYROX, something, or any of those other kind of like mixed modal, endurance specific kind of thing. Yeah, for sure. I think that person's going to look a lot more like a runner, except for the fact that they're going to have to hit certain positions, right? If you want to run a HYROX, or if you want to race a HYROX, you have to be able to hit parallel in your squat, and we want to train your squat in the positions that matter. So they're going to be a little bit more range of motion focused, a little bit more focused on like standards. And it's like, if a runner kind of needs a slightly, works best with like a slightly modified split squat, cool, work with that, right? If you're trying to train for HYROX, you need to be able to do a lunge, and you have to be able to do it well. No runner's winning a medal based on how well they squat. Correct. Right, but like it could be the difference between a good and bad HYROX experience, right? Absolutely. So a lot of it's going to look relatively similar. And again, I would say that their training year might look a little bit different, right? So it's like the volume of hypertrophy, the volume of strength training might be a little bit greater at its greatest peak in the year, and it might look a little bit different. They might be doing a little bit more of it as they're peaking for HYROX, because like they still need to be able to express
some capacity in those movements.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah.
I think last thing to talk about, and like this is, I guess maybe this is like the giveaway. If you've watched this far, if you're interested in, you were interested in this, if there's somebody and they're like, man, I've been doing all this stuff and I'm trying to figure out like how much should I do? How do I balance all of these things? How do I, run and maybe do some lifting and recover and manage my fatigue and my training load and all that stuff appropriately? Like, what would you, what's the advice you would give to somebody? And then obviously, I mean, we'll plug what you do as like, hey, what if you didn't have to worry about that?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing is like managing fatigue, right? Like that's the most important thing. Like I said like a second ago, right? Like don't take a powerlifting program and just pair it with like, I'm going to do my runs in the morning and powerlifting in the evening. It's like, no, right? Like you won't be able to recover from all of that. Right? And so your running will suffer because you're not able to run as hard or as fast because you're fatigued from the powerlifting, and you won't get any stronger because your powerlifting will be too fatigued from your hard runs, right? And so you get into this kind of cycle. So I think the most important thing is understanding what your goal is, right? And structuring your training week and your training plan over a period of time, your training cycles around managing the appropriate level of fatigue. Sometimes I'm going to be okay with like my runs being a little compromised, you know what I mean? And like, that's just not taking the priority at this time of the year. I know that I'm going to go into my runs a little fatigued, but that's okay because I'm getting stronger, right? Or vice versa. If you're only a runner, it's like, okay, well, there's times where like we're just not going to run as hard. We're still going to do a lot of mileage. And so just being able to like have somebody have eyes and like understand how they interplay with each other. And so, that's the value of a coach, right? That's where coaching comes in, not for like the shameless plug of it, right? But like, I do think that is like the important nuance in the whole thing, where it's not just like, okay, strength training has these principles, let me just pop those right into this. It's like some of those principles all strength training principles are true, or sorry, not all of them, but like the true ones are true no matter what.
Muscle diffusion.
Right. The true ones are true no matter what.
Right.
But are you structuring it so that the consequences are what you want the consequences to be, right? That the adaptation is what you want it to be, and that the level of fatigue that you're creating is like what you want it to be, so that you can get up and train the right way the next day, right? And that you can get the stimulus that you need to tomorrow appropriately tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna steal this from my wife's telling me stuff about her job, right? And she's a therapist, and she talks about one of the reasons that people, seek therapists is that people tend to have a bad objective understanding of their lives, right? It's really hard for you to like look at your own life with the sort of like tolerance and grace and whatever that you would give somebody else. And so like a therapist can be like, hey, it seems like, they can just kind of like look at the movie script of your life and be like, no, you're actually the main character here or whatever.
Yeah.
I think like, bringing it back to coaching, right? Bringing it back to what a coach does, we can be just as bad as objectively kind of like understanding our own training stimulus, how we're feeling, how we're stuff like that. And I think sometimes it can be really useful for somebody to be looking at this data and with some remove and be like, hey, it looks like your split times are going down, or this or that, or whatever it is. I think we need to change something, right? I think often for ourselves, and you've worked with coaches, I've worked with coaches, right? Like that's been the thing. Even though that I theoretically can understand
have the knowledge,
when I'm looking at my own experience is so close to me that it can be really hard. So,
yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and that's a perfect analogy, because it's not just about knowing the principles, but like when you put them together, like it's a different experience. And making sure that you like are able to objectively look at that and maneuver things as you need to, because it's not always going to be right. Like you don't write out 12 weeks, and like everything goes perfectly to plan all along the way. It's like we need to adjust, adapt, and modify as we go for pretty much everybody, right? Like almost no one. I've even in our like group classes and our group hybrid, which we can talk about in a second, right? But like no one follows the plan 100% to the T without any fail, like every
hiccup or
without a hiccup,
like,
a speed bump, some sort of like slight change in trajectory throughout, right? Like that's just not how life works. That's not how bodies work. Nothing is like as perfectly linear as our human computational brains want it to be,
Right. Well, I mean, that's a good thing to get into right at the end is like, so obviously when you work with somebody who's like a private training client or a full spectrum training client, somebody who you are like in charge of sort of everything they're doing, fairly easy to make those changes. How do you do it in a group setting?
Yeah, I mean, in a group setting, so we, at Lumos, we have a hybrid conditioning program, and we call it, it's a specialty program, right? And so it's different from your kind of just like run-of-the-mill, pop in, pop out group class. And so we run it, I kind of say like we run it like a team. And so I'm very close to the athletes. I coach all of the classes. I modify all of the training, right? So it's like my eyes are on there, and I'm getting good data points over time really well and in real time. So, for some people who are like struggling to keep up with run volume, it's like, okay, like you need to be where you're at run volume, but we still need to like increase your overall cardio, your aerobic capacity. So we're going to supplement with some machines for this workout. I mean, you're going to use specifically.
Everybody else is doing something
exactly
else.
Right. And so we'll have like all of our workouts kind of have guidelines of like, okay, if we're on the low end of volume, like here's where you're at. If you're on the mid end of volume, here's where you're at. If you're on the high end of volume, here's where you're at. And managing kind of all those things for the person, right? If everybody else is doing Bulgarian split squats, which can be a little like compressive to knee tendons, right? And especially if you get like that runner's knee, that can feel like a little uncomfortable sometimes. So it's like, I'm not going to have that person just because they're in class. It's like, we'll find something else, right? Like we'll do a front foot elevated split squat or just a reverse lunge, something that takes some of that pressure off of the tendons, So it's like finding those things for people in real time is like not a huge challenge to do, but like it doesn't seem like a ton of people are out there doing it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And some of it is like the business model and the class structure and all of that, and not making excuses for other things, but like that's I do it this way so that I can provide that service to people.
Yeah, the idea is that it shouldn't just be big long MetCons, things where everybody's doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean,
things where there
it needs
really
to be progressive.
Yeah, right.
Like it needs to be progressive, and I think that's where it's really hard if you're constantly working with a changing group of people or whatever. It's like everything kind of looks like a long CrossFit MetCon, or it's like 50 down, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 wall balls and something. It's like like there's nothing wrong with that. You know what I mean? But it's like that
for GPP?
Yeah, for
great, right?
Exactly, right. For GPP,
for just
but if you're
getting
training
generally
for a
strong
race,
or whatever, right? With very specific like criteria.
Yeah, with very specific criteria, like that's important. And having somebody who's eyeing you, let's say you travel for 3 weeks of a 6-week cycle, and you're coming back in. It's like, okay, how do we get the most out of these 3 weeks of progression? And having somebody there that's like managing the progression and managing your involvement in the progression, I think is really important.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope you got something out of this.
Yeah.
Whether you are a Lumos member, a hybrid member, or somebody watching from afar, being like, oh, maybe I need to add a little wrinkle to my game. We're gonna be trying to do more of these. If you have anything that you want to know more about, running specific, hybrid specific, or whatever it is, shoot it our way. We will make that, something that we speak to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And,
you got questions, let us know.
Awesome.
We
Brett, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Don.
We're back, baby.
Yeah, we're back. All right, awesome. Thank you, sir.
We have to turn all the different things off.
Thanks so much for